When thinking about the self-selected project, I knew I wanted to make something that was new and special. I started thinking about what I could do, and I started asking myself how I could solve a real problem. I knew I had to include the Sustainable Development Goals and started thinking about them. I also started to think about how I could make a project that was unique. Once I had a bunch of different ideas in mind, I decided to go to my mom to ask her for feedback on which idea would be best. I started telling her about the different ideas I had. These included organic coconut jars and organic perfumes and skincare. At first, the problem I wanted to solve was the amount of plastic used nowadays, but my mom presented me with another problem. She said that in quarantine it was getting especially hard to get certain vegetables, and that the problem I could solve would be for my family to get fresh, accessible, organic, and affordable greens. As soon as I heard this, I knew this would be my project. I wrote down the problem and started thinking of possible solutions. These included making a garden, making a vertical garden, having contact with a farmer, or having food deliveries from the supermarket. I debated the pros and cons of each one, and I finally settled on making a vertical garden. Once I made the objective, I started answering important questions such as who was the target audience, who was the client, and what would be the benefits of constructing a vertical garden. I also thought about which sustainable development goals this problem would correlate with. At the end, I decided to go with number 3, good health and well-being, number 12, responsible consumption and production, and number 15, life on land. I started thinking about specifications I would like my garden to have, and I started thinking about necessities and desires for the garden. I also decided to poll potential clients to get a sense of what I was looking at. I then made a list of questions I had and things I knew I had to research. I then justified and prioritized them. I then proceeded to answer the questions. I then proceeded to look at existing products to get a sense of what I needed and what could be good for my garden. I made a SWOT analysis for each, and I wrote the positives which I knew I personally wanted to use. Finally, I asked my mom to rate the vertical gardens I'd seen to see what she wanted and what she liked and what she didn't. In Criterion B, I went over what I learned in Criterion A, and I set the final requirements to solve in my design problem. I explained why each requirement needed to be solved, and I explained my essential versus my desired requirements. I went over the product details and explained them thoroughly. I then sketched and designed 10 different vertical gardens based on the pros that I had written before. I then evaluated and analyzed each design, comparing them to the design requirements. I then made some last-minute research. I then made an experiment to test one of the requirements and one of the designs. I then chose the final design. This one fit the requirements the best and were the most approved by myself and the target audience. I made different tests to make sure that this design that I chose was the one that fit the best. I then sketched the final designs from many views and added the measurements in. Once I was sure I had a lot of visuals, I decided to put all the measurements and processes together. I listed all of the materials and compared the final design that I had now made with all of the requirements. For my Criterion C, I started by making a step-by-step process of what I needed to do when I was actually going to construct my vertical garden. I added the requirements for the process and additional sketches. I also added the measurements and the materials. This is how my final product looks like. I am very happy with the result. This is the exact step-by-step process I used when I created this vertical garden. I included a chart with the steps, the pictures, the resources, the process, the time, and the importance of this step. I made the list as clear as possible to make sure anybody could replicate the design. I then explained how I solved each design specification, and I added the final measurements, the final materials, and final sketches. Finally, I explained all the changes I made in both my design and my process. I started Criterion D by making a list of all the possible tests I could conduct to make sure my design was made properly. I then conducted all of the tests. Then I explained why I met each of the requirements. I also gave a summary on each of the results of the tests. I also made a list of the overall strengths and weaknesses. I then explained each of the strengths and weaknesses and how I could improve these. I improved them and made sketches and explanations of the improvements. I also explained how these changes would affect the solution. Finally, I explained how the solution was met, how my product has been improved after the feedback, and the impact the solution has in both my target audience and myself.